Welcome to night 20 to fall asleep fast. This is a quiet place where you don't need to focus, remember, or do anything at all. You can simply listen or let the sound fade gently into the background. If it feels right, you can softly like this video now or leave a calm comment sharing where you're listening from and what time it is. There's no need to rush, everything here moves slowly. Tonight, we explore imagining an Egyptian London where pyramids rose above the ancient Thames. A calm and unhurried story from the past, told gently, without urgency and without expectation. You don't need to stay awake for it. You don't need to follow every detail. If you were here last night, welcome back. And if this is your first night, you can begin right here, exactly as you are. A new night will be waiting for you again tomorrow. But for now, allow your breathing to slow, your thoughts to drift, and let this story quietly carry you toward rest. The river moved as it always had, slow and untroubled, pressing its dark surface gently against the curve of the northern bank. The Thames carried no urgency in its current. It folded around bends of mud and reed, gliding past timber posts driven into the soft earth, past narrow jetties that leaned slightly with age. The tide rose and fell without spectacle, leaving faint lines along the shore where water had briefly rested before retreating again. Mist hovered low above the surface, not thick enough to conceal the opposite bank, but enough to soften its edges. The outlines of wooden buildings stood in patient irregularity, their beams darkened by years of damp air. Roofs sloped toward the river, catching droplets that gathered and fell in quiet succession. There were no towers pressing sharply into the sky, no geometry beyond what hands had shaped from oak and rope. Everything seemed grown rather than built, as if the city had emerged slowly from the soil itself. The air held the scent of wet wood and distant peat smoke. Somewhere along the bank, a small torch burned in a bracket fixed to a post, its flame steady despite the cool breeze drifting along the water. The light did not reach far. It only marked a point of human presence, a reminder that the river was observed, tended, and known. Beyond it, darkness continued without resistance. Boats rested close to the shore, their hulls gently knocking against timber with soft, hollow sounds. Each movement was slight, governed more by breathing water than by wind. Ropes dipped and tightened with the tide's rhythm. A thin layer of silt clung to the lower planks, evidence of many journeys that had ended here, only to begin again at first light. The city beyond the riverbank remained subdued. Narrow paths wound between wooden structures, their surfaces packed firm by years of footsteps. No grand avenues interrupted the pattern. No monumental shapes altered the horizon. The skyline rose and fell in small increments, a chimney here, a pitched roof there, all contained within the modest vocabulary of timber and thatch. Above, the sky opened wide and unobstructed. Clouds drifted in long, pale bands, revealing intervals of faint starlight. The moon hung low, casting a diluted silver over water and roof alike. Its reflection broke gently on the river's surface, scattering into fragments that shimmered and rejoined without haste. Nothing in the scene suggested ambition. The river did not strain against its banks. The buildings did not attempt to outgrow their materials. The land met the water in a manner that felt negotiated long ago and quietly accepted. Even the sounds were restrained, the occasional shift of wood, the distant call of a night bird, the low murmur of currents sliding past stone. Along the eastern stretch of the bank, the ground broadened slightly, forming a shallow terrace above the waterline. Grass grew in uneven patches there, resilient against the damp. The earth bore faint impressions where carts had once stood and where materials had been unloaded, though at this hour no movement disturbed the soil. The space remained open, defined more by absence than by structure. From this vantage, the river seemed wider than it would in daylight. Without the distraction of color, it became a field of motion and shadow. The opposite bank blurred into suggestion, a darker line against the horizon. The city's modest edges dissolved into the surrounding night. The Thames had known many forms of settlement along its course. It had flowed beside Roman stone and Saxon timber, beside markets and monasteries. Yet here, in this stretch of quiet, it appeared untouched by any lasting monument. It carried memory in its depths, but revealed little of it on the surface. Its authority was not imposed but inherent, a steady passage that preceded and would outlast whatever rose beside it. Near the water's edge, reeds bent and straightened in patient cycles. Their thin leaves caught droplets of mist, which gathered and slid downward before disappearing into the mud below. The bank itself bore subtle layers: darker earth where the tide had recently receded, lighter patches where the ground had dried. Each mark testified to repetition rather than change. Further inland, the wooden dwellings seemed almost to lean toward the river, as if listening. Their beams were uneven, shaped by hand and necessity. No two structures were identical. Doors sat slightly off-center. Windows opened at differing heights. The irregularity created a softness in the skyline, an absence of rigid pattern. In this quiet arrangement, time felt diffused. There was no single moment to observe, no event to anticipate. The river moved as it had the night before and would the night after. The buildings absorbed moisture and released it again with the morning's warmth. Smoke would rise at dawn, meals would be prepared, boats would depart. Yet none of that pressed upon the present hour. The terrace along the eastern bank remained empty, its surface faintly illuminated by the moon's patient light. The ground there seemed prepared for something, though nothing yet occupied it. It did not appear incomplete. Rather, it rested in potential as any open space beside water might. The soil lay undisturbed except for shallow ruts that had long since softened at their edges. A thin current shifted direction as the tide began its gradual turn. The boats adjusted, ropes tightening almost imperceptibly. Reflections stretched and narrowed across the surface. The mist thinned slightly, revealing more of the opposite shore, though still in softened outline. The river's breadth held the eye. It invited no questions and offered no declarations. It simply continued, folding around bends and under the open sky. The city along its banks remained modest, content in its scale, its materials drawn from nearby forest and field. Yet at the far edge of sight, where the terrace met the dim horizon, there lingered a suggestion of altered shape. It was not distinct enough to be named, not formed clearly enough to interrupt the calm. It appeared only as a faint angular shadow against the low band of sky, as though geometry itself were beginning to gather in the mist. The river did not react. Its surface accepted the reflection without judgment, breaking it into gentle fragments as it had done with moonlight and cloud. The wooden dwellings remained unchanged, their beams dark and steady. The open ground along the eastern bank held its quiet, but the air above it seemed subtly weighted, as if something patient and deliberate had begun to settle there. The mist shifted again, drawing aside for a moment before returning to its soft veil. And in that barely perceptible clearing, the outline of stone began, not rising abruptly, but resting into place as if it had always been waiting beside the tide. The faint angular shadow did not sharpen all at once. It remained patient within the mist, as though it understood the rhythm of the river and chose not to disturb it. Gradually, as the air shifted and the tide drew another quiet breath, the outline clarified. What had seemed a trick of light resolved into a slope of stone rising from the eastern terrace, its surface catching a thin wash of moonlight. The form did not tower in defiance of the sky. It inclined steadily upward, each face smooth and deliberate, meeting at a distant point that disappeared into pale haze. Its geometry differed from the timber lines of the surrounding dwellings. Where wood bowed slightly and thatch softened at the edges, this structure held firm angles, composed and balanced. Yet it did not feel abrupt. It stood as if it had settled there over many seasons, allowing the earth to accept its weight. Along the riverbank, the water adjusted without hesitation. The Thames extended its dark surface toward the stone, touching its base with the same indifferent grace it offered to timber posts and moored boats. A faint reflection trembled across the current, breaking and reforming with each small movement of tide. The pyramid's face, pale against the night, appeared almost fluid in the shifting mirror of the river. The terrace that had seemed empty now revealed its quiet occupation. The ground around the structure bore subtle signs of careful preparation. The soil had been leveled, pressed firm beneath a foundation of limestone blocks that rested close together, their seams precise but not ostentatious. The color of the stone differed from the clay beneath it. It held a warmer tone, faintly luminous even under muted light, as though it carried with it a memory of sun. No scaffolding stood against its sides. No scattered tools lay abandoned nearby. The scene suggested completion rather than construction. The pyramid did not appear newly raised. Its surfaces were already softened by the damp air of the river, fine beads of moisture gathering along its lower courses. Moss had begun to trace delicate lines where stone met soil, as if northern weather had already claimed acquaintance. Beyond it, further shapes gradually emerged from the mist. Not one solitary monument, but several, each spaced with measured care along the terrace. They varied in size, some broader and lower, others ascending with more pronounced incline. Together they formed a rhythm along the bank, their silhouettes echoing one another without exact repetition. The skyline shifted gently, no longer defined solely by timber and smoke, but by these calm plains of stone. The city did not recoil from their presence. The wooden buildings remained where they had always stood, their beams dark and steady. Smoke would still rise from their hearths at dawn. Paths would still wind between doorways and toward the river's edge. The pyramids did not replace what was there. They simply stood among it, their geometry resting alongside the irregular shapes of wood and rope. At the base of one structure, a narrow stairway descended toward the water. Each step was broad and shallow, worn smooth by careful shaping. The lowest stone met the river at high tide, allowing the water to wash gently against its edge. When the tide withdrew, it left behind a thin glistening trace as though acknowledging the meeting. The air around the stone carried a different stillness. Timber absorbed sound, it creaked softly, expanded and contracted with moisture. The limestone seemed to hold silence more firmly. Even the small sounds of lapping water felt altered, subdued against the solid plain. The mist moved differently here, gliding along the angled faces before dissolving into the open night. From a distance, the pyramids might have seemed foreign to the northern shore. Yet up close, their surfaces bore markings that spoke of careful adaptation. Subtle carvings traced along the lower courses, patterns of reeds and flowing lines that mirrored the river itself. The motifs did not appear imposed. They felt integrated, as though the language of one landscape had learned to echo the other. The Thames continued its steady passage, unconcerned with origin or intention. It flowed past stone as easily as it had passed wood. Boats resting along the bank found their reflections altered, their lantern light flickering across pale surfaces instead of dark timber alone. The change did not demand attention. It simply entered the field of vision and remained. The moon rose slightly higher, shifting the angle of illumination. The pyramid faces caught more light along their upper reaches, while their bases sank into deeper shadow. The contrast remained gentle. No harsh edges interrupted the quiet. The geometry seemed to breathe with the night, expanding and receding as mist thickened and thinned. Along the terrace, the ground between structures remained open. Grass and low growth pressed against the edges of stone, softening the transition between earth and monument. The space invited slow passage rather than gathering. It felt less like a site of spectacle and more like a place of measured movement, where steps would fall lightly and without haste. The presence of these forms altered the horizon in subtle increments. Where once the skyline rose and fell irregularly, it now held points of deliberate ascent. Yet even these peaks did not challenge the sky. They met it quietly, their tips dissolving into cloud when the mist returned. No banners hung from their sides. No torches burned at their summits. The pyramids required no adornment to assert themselves. Their stillness served as their defining feature. In the damp northern air, their limestone faces absorbed moonlight and returned it in softened glow, neither bright nor dim, but steady. As the tide began another gradual turn, water reached slightly higher along the lowest stones. The contact produced no resistance. The river and the pyramid shared the same edge without tension. In the faint reflection, the inverted shape extended downward, forming a second, trembling monument beneath the surface. The city beyond adjusted its quiet patterns around this new geometry. Paths curved gently to meet the terrace. Timber structures stood at respectful distance, their shadows mingling with those cast by stone. Nothing appeared displaced. The change felt less like an arrival and more like a revealing, as though the mist had simply withdrawn to show what had long been waiting. Yet beneath the visible plains of limestone, there rested an unseen weight. The stability of these forms suggested depth beyond the eye's reach. The soil that supported them must have been opened, measured, and prepared with equal care. The calm surface above hinted at patient labor below, foundations laid deep into northern clay. The moonlight traced a thin line along the edge where stone met earth. The seam appeared seamless from afar, but closer inspection revealed precise joints, blocks fitted with deliberate alignment. The terrace, once empty, now carried gravity. It bore more than surface shape, it carried mass that pressed quietly downward. The mist shifted once more, sliding low across the base of the nearest pyramid. For a moment, the structure seemed to float above the ground, its lower courses obscured. Then the air cleared again, restoring the sense of contact between stone and soil. The river did not slow. It continued its ancient motion, brushing the stairway, circling moored boats, moving past the angled faces without preference. The pyramids stood at the edge of the tide, neither advancing nor retreating, their presence measured and complete. And as the eye lingered along the terrace, tracing the lines where limestone rested against dark earth, attention began to drift downward, toward the hidden depth beneath the surface, where the true weight of stone met the yielding clay of the northern shore. Beneath the calm plains of limestone, beneath the seams that appeared so effortless in moonlight, the earth held a deeper story. The northern soil, dark and heavy with moisture, had once lain undisturbed along the eastern bank. It had known the pressure of footsteps and the shallow impressions of cartwheels, but little more. Now it carried a steadier burden, one that pressed downward with patient certainty. The clay along the Thames was dense and slow to yield. It clung to tools and hardened when exposed to air. To open it required time rather than force. Trenches had been carved into its depth not in haste, but in careful increments. Each layer removed revealed another of similar weight and texture, until the ground reached a firmness capable of holding stone without shifting. At the base of each pyramid, limestone blocks extended downward beyond what the eye could measure from above. These lower courses were broader than those visible at the surface, spreading outward to distribute the weight across the soil. Their placement followed a quiet geometry, precise but unadorned. The joints between them were tight, not from spectacle but from necessity. Stability depended not on height alone, but on the unseen breadth below. In the dim light of early dawn, when mist still lay close to the ground, figures moved slowly within these excavated spaces. They were not hurried. Their steps were measured, their hands steady as they guided stone into alignment. The work did not produce sharp sounds. The clay absorbed much of the movement, softening the impact of block against block. Even the shifting of tools carried a muted quality, as if the soil itself preferred restraint. The men who labored there did so without spectacle. Their garments were simple, suited to damp ground and cool air. They knelt upon wooden planks laid temporarily across the trench floors, preventing their weight from sinking too deeply into the clay. With levers and rope, they adjusted each block until it rested in quiet balance against its neighbors. Once set, the stone seemed to belong to the earth, its pale surface quickly darkened by contact with soil. The Thames lay only a short distance away, its tide rising and falling in patient cycles. The builders understood its rhythm. Foundations were placed with awareness of water's reach, ensuring that the lowest stones would not be undermined by the river's persistent touch. Channels were carved discreetly, allowing excess moisture to drain away from the base. These measures were not elaborate. They reflected a knowledge of land and tide accumulated over many seasons. Above ground, the pyramids appeared composed and complete. Below, the foundation spread like the roots of an unseen tree. The clay accepted this structure without protest. It compressed slightly under the weight, then settled. Over time, the earth and stone learned one another's contours, adjusting in increments too small to notice from the surface. The workers did not speak loudly. Their communication passed in gestures and brief glances. The placement of each block required attention, but not strain. There was no urgency to finish before some impending change. The task unfolded across days that blended into one another, marked only by the shifting of light from dawn to dusk and back again. When a layer was completed, it disappeared beneath the next. What had required hours of careful alignment vanished from view, sealed within the growing mass above. Yet its presence remained essential. The visible pyramid depended entirely upon these buried courses, upon the patient leveling of clay and the quiet fitting of stone against stone. Rain visited the trenches at intervals. It gathered along the exposed earth, pooling in shallow depressions before being guided away through narrow channels. The builders paused during heavier showers, standing beneath temporary coverings while the soil absorbed its share. Once the rain lessened, they returned, adjusting surfaces softened by water, restoring lines to their intended planes. As the foundation deepened, the air within the trench cooled. The clay walls held moisture and scent, enclosing the space in a muted stillness. The men moved carefully, aware of the depth around them. Wooden braces supported the sides where necessary, preventing collapse. These supports were temporary, destined to be removed once stone fully replaced earth. The process required repetition. Block after block descended into place, each one contributing to a base that would never be seen once the structure rose complete. There was no ornamentation below ground, no carved patterns or polished faces. The stone here remained functional, its purpose purely to bear weight and distribute it evenly across uncertain soil. Gradually, the trench floors rose again as courses accumulated. What had been depth returned to surface. The earth once removed was replaced and pressed firm around the outer edges of the foundation, sealing it into the landscape. Grass would one day grow over these margins, disguising the labor that had unfolded beneath. From the river, little of this effort was visible. A passerby in a boat might notice figures moving along the terrace, the occasional lifting of a block, the subtle shifting of earth. Yet the true extent of the work lay hidden from view, contained within the soil's dark embrace. As each pyramid reached its intended breadth below ground, the upward courses aligned seamlessly with the foundation beneath. The visible slope drew strength from unseen geometry. The northern clay, once soft and impressionable, now carried weight with steady composure. It had been asked to hold something foreign to its texture, and it did so without resistance. The rhythm of the work became part of the riverbank's routine. At dawn, figures descended into trenches. By midday, blocks were guided into place. At dusk, tools were gathered and the site left in quiet order. No dramatic milestones marked progress. The change occurred gradually, measured in layers rather than in leaps. The city nearby adjusted with similar calm. Paths remained open. Boats continued to arrive and depart. Timber dwellings stood undisturbed. The presence of stone foundations did not demand alteration from the rest of the settlement. Instead, it settled into the background of daily life, its steady expansion accepted as part of the river's evolving edge. As weeks passed, the final courses below ground disappeared beneath compacted soil. The trenches filled, their boundaries smoothed until they merged with the terrace once more. Only the pyramids above hinted at the breadth of stone concealed beneath their bases. The weight that had once been potential now rested fully upon the clay. The ground did not crack or sink. It held firm, distributing pressure outward through carefully measured lines. Beneath the surface, stone met soil in quiet agreement. With the foundations complete, attention shifted naturally upward and outward. The terrace no longer bore open trenches or exposed earth. It presented a continuous plain from which the pyramids rose with composed certainty. The river, reflecting their faces, now flowed beside structures anchored deeply, and without doubt boats approaching from the bend in the Thames would see only the angled slopes and pale surfaces. They would not glimpse the broad courses hidden below, nor the careful leveling that allowed such height to stand in damp northern ground. The unseen work had concluded, leaving the visible forms to greet the water alone. And as the tide advanced once more toward the stairways at the base, carrying lantern-lit vessels along its dark current, the life of the river began to move more closely between old timber docks and these newly secured plains of stone. The Thames carried itself with an unhurried patience, moving past the terrace where pyramids rose and measured calm. Its surface shimmered faintly under the soft moonlight, reflecting the pale faces of stone and the muted darkness of timbered buildings. The river did not rush. It bent around each curve of the bank, curling around piers and wooden stakes with gentle insistence, as if tracing the outline of the night itself. Along the waterway, boats floated with subtle motion. Their hulls pressed lightly against the tide, rocking and shifting in small rhythms that echoed across the calm surface. Some were long, narrow barges, their decks bare except for coils of rope and bundles of goods, resting without urgency. Others were smaller craft, carrying the faint scent of wet wood and tar, rocking gently as currents nudged them forward. The wooden piers extended cautiously into the river, their timbers darkened by years of moisture. Planks rested level with one another, though uneven with age. Occasionally a supporting post leaned slightly, softened by decades of contact with water. The river brushed against them with quiet persistence, washing its mirrored surface over their bases before flowing onward. The reflections of the pyramids intertwined with the piers, merging stone and timber into a single composition of shapes and muted color. A soft mist lingered along the shore, rising and drifting across the decks. It clung lightly to ropes, coiled or trailing over edges, and dusted the surface of stone stairs leading down from the terraces. Even in this haze, the outlines of vessels were clear, their forms defined more by silhouette than by detail. The moonlight skimmed over hulls and decks, leaving fleeting impressions of curvature and texture. Boatmen moved with gentle care. Hands guided lines, adjusted rudders, shifted small loads of cargo without sound beyond the soft scrape of rope along wood. There was no urgency in their actions. Each motion unfolded slowly, part of a rhythm set by water and tide. Footsteps fell lightly on boards, absorbed immediately by the damp surfaces. In this light, labor became almost imperceptible, a quiet accompaniment to the river's own measured flow. From the terrace, the pyramids watched over the river without interruption. Their pale faces reflected in the water, fragments breaking apart with every gentle ripple. No surface disturbance of stone or water appeared abrupt. Instead, reflections traced the movement of boats, folding and unfolding in soft patterns. The river accepted their presence, holding each shadow and shape without question. At the edges of the banks, reeds bent in unison with the tide. Their movement was slower than the river but harmonized with its course. They whispered faintly in the light breeze, adding texture to the stillness of the night. Beyond the reeds, the shoreline revealed traces of older docks, timbers partially submerged, softened and worn by long contact with water. The old and new coexisted seamlessly, wood and stone, boat and pyramid, past and present quietly touching without disturbance. Small lanterns glimmered across some vessels, their flames steady against faint drafts of wind. Each light offered a point of reference along the dark water, illuminating lines of rope or the faint curvature of a deck. Their glow extended only slightly, leaving the river largely in soft shadow. Light and reflection played together, forming ephemeral patterns that slowly drifted down the tide. The current drew some boats closer together, though not by design. They shifted in small increments, nudged by eddies and a subtle swell beneath the surface. Oars dipped silently, disturbing only the immediate water around them. The river's voice was quiet, its motion gentle, carrying boats along without urgency. Even the sound of moving timber blended seamlessly with the lapping of water against hulls. Along the eastern terrace, observers might have noticed the faint ripple of water against the pyramid's lower steps. The tide extended and withdrew, touching stone without erosion, leaving glistening trails of moisture where it met each course. The effect was mesmerizing in its steadiness, a simple interplay between current and monument, without drama or rush. The air carried the faint scent of damp wood and riverweed, softened by drifting fog. Sounds came not in sharp bursts but as sustained murmurs. The gentle slap of oars, the whisper of rope sliding over timber, the soft ripple of water across stone. Each blended into the next, forming a continuous stream of quiet sensation that extended into the night. Some vessels bore small goods, carefully stacked and bound, awaiting movement at the river's gentle pace. Others were empty, floating lightly, their keels tracing the surface without friction. The interplay of water and hull created patterns that shifted slowly with each passing moment. No one boat dominated the scene. All moved in unison with the tide, each participating in a collective rhythm. The mist around the terraces thickened in places, softening edges and blending stone and timber together. Reflections in the water became less distinct, transforming angular forms into soft gradients of light and shadow. The pyramids mirrored images elongated and bent, giving them a presence that felt more like a quiet companion than an architectural assertion. Above, clouds drifted across the sky, partially veiling the moon. Light dimmed and brightened with imperceptible slowness, alternating between cooler silver and warmer tones upon stone and water. The river caught these changes, shifting reflections minutely with each passing cloud. The boats continued their movement, adjusting naturally to these variations without disruption. Along the banks, small birds occasionally moved within the reeds. Their presence was subtle, blending with the rhythm of the river. The air remained still in most places, disturbed only by minor eddies around protruding stones or timber posts. The landscape accepted movement without reaction. Nothing seemed hurried or out of place. Paths along the terraces led toward the water, faintly traced in damp soil. Their presence indicated movement of people over time, yet at this hour they lay undisturbed. From these paths, one might notice the gentle alignment of boats, the soft angularity of pyramids, and the dim glow of lanterns, all existing within the same expansive quiet. The river's expanse appeared broader than in daylight, its calm surface reflecting subtle interplay of objects and light. The pyramid's faces, the boats' hulls, and the distant timber structures formed a cohesive composition. Movement occurred, but only in slow increments, as if the river itself dictated a pace that all else observed. Even when vessels approached the small stairways of stone at the pyramid bases, the rhythm remained constant. Oars entered the water deliberately, ropes adjusted carefully. The moon's reflection shifted accordingly, splintered briefly, then resumed smooth undulation. Nothing interrupted the continuity of river and terrace, of boat and pyramid. The horizon beyond the immediate bank remained subdued, soft edges merging land and water. No skyline intruded sharply. The distant city appeared muted, its form suggested rather than defined. Attention lingered naturally on the river, on gentle movement, on reflections that intertwined with stone and timber. The experience of space remained calm, continuous, and unbroken. And as the tide flowed onward, threading vessels past old wood and new stone alike, the river guided the observer's gaze gently along its current, preparing to carry attention toward the terraces and streets beyond, where the city's quiet presence awaited subtle notice. Beyond the gentle flow of the Thames, the terraces rose gradually, stepping upward from the riverbank in measured sequences. Each level held a collection of wooden dwellings, their beams darkened by years of rain and mist, their walls blending into the soft shadows of the night. Narrow streets ran between them, winding quietly as if aware that the night required restraint, that every corner and alley existed for movement slow and unhurried. The city did not call attention to itself, it simply revealed itself in layers, one gentle descent after another. The terraces carried traces of human presence, but nothing demanded focus. Softly pressed paths traced the edges of small gardens, and occasional fences marked boundaries without assertion. Where lanterns hung, their glow was subtle, spilling across planks and cobblestones in pale pools that allowed more shadow than light. The moon drifted between clouds, casting an intermittent sheen over rooftops, accentuating angles and lines without harshness. Shadows elongated in every courtyard and passage, curling around posts and windowsills, softening the contrast between structure and open air. Roofs, many steeply pitched, were adorned with thatch and wooden shingles, each piece layered patiently, as if time had itself arranged the forms. Small chimneys punctuated the skyline, sending faint tendrils of smoke into the cool night. The smell of embers, mingled with the damp scent of timber, hung subtly in the air. The smoke rose slowly, curling around angled beams before dissolving into mist, marking the rhythm of domestic life without urgency. The streets themselves moved in gentle gradients, some almost imperceptibly sloping toward the river, others turning delicately to connect terraces at higher levels. Each street bore the faint imprint of repeated passage, the occasional stone pressed into earth, the wear of wagon wheels over softer soil, the quiet erosion of footsteps over decades. The patterns were familiar and forgiving, guiding the observer without demanding attention or thought. Windows glimmered occasionally, reflecting moonlight in tiny shards, hinting at interiors without revealing detail. Inside, warmth lingered from past fires, invisible yet sensed in the cool air of the streets. No one moved with haste. The city exhaled slowly, as if aware that every observer might pause, notice, or drift past without engagement. The rhythm was deliberate but gentle, a sequence of small, deliberate movements echoing from terrace to terrace. Small gardens or enclosed courtyards provided occasional variation. Low hedges or wooden fences framed narrow spaces, each holding plantings subdued by the night. Leaves shimmered with dew, trembling lightly in the breeze that whispered down streets and along rooflines. Even flora participated in the stillness, bending subtly, offering patterns of growth that reflected the measured pace of the city. The terrace steps themselves, carefully cut from local stone or timber, allowed passage between levels without disruption. Each step bore the imprint of countless journeys, softened edges telling of slow adaptation over time. No railing intruded, boundaries were suggested rather than enforced. One could ascend or descend, feeling the gradient shift beneath each footfall, and the journey remained calm, almost invisible in its steadiness. Lanterns, when present, glowed in muted hues, pale amber and soft cream, diffused by glass or paper coverings. Their reflections in small puddles on uneven streets doubled their effect, creating a quiet dance of light that neither distracted nor demanded attention. The rhythm of illumination changed only with the movement of clouds or the gentle flicker of flame, blending seamlessly with moonlight. From the terraces, glimpses of the river reached the eye. Between buildings and through narrow passages, reflections of boats and water broke the continuity of stone and timber, reminding one of the ebb and flow of the Thames below. The distant glimmer of the river acted as a quiet counterpoint to the more stable forms of streets and roofs, a gentle conversation between stillness and movement. The air itself seemed composed to match the visual calm. Cool and slightly damp, it carried the faint aroma of wet wood, earth, and lingering smoke. Movement through it was effortless. It offered no resistance, no sudden chill or heat, only a soft presence that welcomed observation and lingered without intrusion. Sounds, too, were moderated. Footsteps fell lightly on cobbles, the distant lap of water softened by distance, the occasional rustle of leaves caught by a slow breeze, all combining to form a continuous, subdued chorus. Doors along the terraces remained closed, yet hints of activity could be imagined within. Perhaps a kettle had been set upon a quiet hearth, perhaps a bundle of cloth lay folded and untouched for the night. These details suggested life without asserting it, offering subtle texture to the calm tableau without prompting curiosity or concern. The city breathed softly, its rhythm unbroken. The structures themselves displayed signs of patient construction. Beams were joined carefully, shingles layered methodically, walls aligned with gentle symmetry that seemed guided more by habit and care than by any formal plan. Variations between dwellings softened the uniformity, lending the terraces a gentle irregularity. Nothing shouted for attention. Every form seemed intended to be seen and forgotten in the same quiet motion. Narrow alleys led toward hidden courtyards, some bordered by stone walls, others by timber fences. Each corridor guided the eye and foot slowly, turning gradually, never abruptly. Shadows shifted with the moon, deepening in some recesses, lifting in others, creating a sense of movement within stillness. The terraces appeared to breathe as a whole, expanding and contracting imperceptibly with the tide of night air. The city's edges blended seamlessly into the surrounding terrain. Grass and low growth crept between planks and stones, softening boundaries. Where terraces ended and fields began, the transition was gentle, imperceptible from a distance. The terraces did not dominate the land but rested upon it, following subtle contours, absorbing the quiet influence of topography and soil beneath. Occasionally, the eye might catch the faint trace of a path leading further inland. Its soil was soft, pressed unevenly by repeated passage. Small stones bordered edges, not as barriers but as suggestions of course. The path continued beyond observation, disappearing between dwellings, hinting at extension without insistence. Movement along it would remain slow, deliberate, unhurried, part of the city's quiet breathing. And as the terraces extended upward and inward, their rooftops, chimneys, and muted gardens formed a cohesive rhythm, inviting attention to wander softly among them. The mind could drift over these quiet plains, moving from one structure to the next without hurry, preparing naturally to notice the texture of each dwelling, the arrangement of shingles and beams, the subtle variations in material that defined life upon these elevated streets. Upon closer inspection, each dwelling revealed its quiet intricacies, the subtle interplay of timber and stone that formed the city's calm character. Wooden beams, weathered to muted shades of gray and brown, ran along walls and rooflines in measured sequences. Their surfaces bore gentle traces of rain and sun, worn smooth in places, rough in others where grain had resisted centuries of exposure. Shadows settled softly in the small depressions of knots and splits, creating delicate patterns that shifted imperceptibly as moonlight passed across them. The textures seemed almost alive in their quiet persistence, each mark and groove telling nothing of urgency, only of passage through time. Stone walls, set between timber frames, displayed their own quiet patience. Some blocks bore the slight unevenness of hand-cut shaping, edges softened by weather and touch. Their surfaces caught dew and mist in a fine sheen, reflecting faint glimmers of light that moved slowly with the night. Mortar, aged and subtly cracked, held each piece without prominence, neither calling attention to its presence nor allowing the stone to move. The interaction of stone and wood created a rhythm that the eye could follow, tracing horizontal and vertical lines without distraction, as if the materials themselves breathed with the night. Roof shingles overlapped in orderly progression, each row guided naturally by gravity and craft. Some had darkened with moisture, others lightened with exposure, forming gradients of subtle hue that could be observed in shifting moonlight. The texture of each shingle, rough along the edges, fine in its plainer face, invited quiet consideration. The buildings did not demand recognition. They offered it gently to any observer willing to linger, to drift from eave to beam without hurry. Where timber met stone, the junctions were precise, yet not rigid. Slight gaps allowed for expansion, contraction, and the quiet settling of materials over time. Moisture darkened boards here, left pale streaks there, and the play of light and shadow accentuated these variations without drama. Beams carried small imperfections, tiny splinters, faint ridges of grain, that gave character to otherwise regular lines. The eye, moving slowly, could explore these surfaces endlessly, each glance uncovering nuances unnoticed before. Windows, framed in timber, cast their borders into soft shadow along walls. The glass, where present, reflected the faint moon and lanterns from the river, breaking the geometry of beams and stone with subtle, transient light. Each reflection was delicate, shifting with the slightest movement of air or the slow progression of clouds above. The effect was one of gentle dynamism, of surfaces alive yet calm, moving in tandem with wind, light, and moisture. Doors set into walls of wood and stone displayed textures of handling and weather. The surfaces were marked by centuries of opening and closing, each motion leaving traces too small for hurry to notice. Hinges, often simple iron, showed the quiet corrosion of exposure, darkening gently but never jaggedly. Latches fit snugly, offering functional subtlety rather than prominence. The tactile nature of these materials seemed designed to welcome touch without insisting upon it, offering reassurance rather than command. Along terraces and small courtyards, wooden fences and low partitions further explored texture. Planks varied slightly in width and hue, joints darkened by shadow and softened by age. Rain and dew traced faint lines along their length, following natural grooves in the grain. Each post settled into the earth, its base darkened by absorption of moisture, its surface dry above. Where two pieces met, the contrast was faint but deliberate, a quiet dialogue of wood shaping space without interruption. The light that fell across these surfaces accentuated textures in gentle, patient ways. Moonlight pooled in depressions, leaving beams and shingles lighter or darker in soft contrast. Mist carried moisture onto timber and stone, highlighting surface grain, emphasizing the differences between old and new, smooth and rough. Shadows lengthened slowly across walls, revealing details that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Every element seemed to wait, offering itself to calm observation. Courtyards and alleys further illustrated this subtle interplay. Stone paths, often bordered by timber edging, held uneven textures softened by years of footsteps. Individual stones shifted slightly in the earth, creating gentle undulations. Moss and lichen, where they clung, provided muted color, a soft green or pale gray, blending harmoniously with wood and stone alike. The tactile qualities of these surfaces were quiet but distinct, forming a continuous sensory layer across terraces, alleys, and walls. The occasional small roof overhang added dimension to texture. Shingles met beams at angles that created shadows within shadows, hiding faint ridges and revealing faint edges. Water collected in these indentations during rain, only to be drawn away by gravity, leaving streaks and marks that enriched the surface. Sun and moonlight moved across these shapes, playing slowly, accentuating depth and form without suddenness. Even the smallest architectural details contributed. Wooden brackets, carved sparsely and subtly, held beams without fanfare. Stone steps, worn and slightly uneven, marked the passage of countless footsteps without dominance. Edges of walls were softened by time, corners rounded in patient approximation, forming visual continuity with the natural variation of timber. Each element worked together to produce a quiet harmony of material and light, inviting an observer to drift through observation without end. Textures were not confined to horizontal planes. Vertical surfaces, whether timber posts, stone walls, or combined junctions, offered lines for the eye to follow. Faint cracks, subtle ridges, and minute variations in color provided points of interest that required attention only if desired. Light shifted across these planes in measured increments, moving from brightness to shadow so gradually it could almost be missed by a distracted mind. The interaction of surfaces and illumination formed a slow rhythm, one that matched the observer's breathing, encouraging ease and stillness. The city, observed in such close detail, revealed layers of subtlety. Each building, each street segment, each fence or step contributed to a texture that was coherent yet varied. Timber and stone worked in concert, responding to moisture, light, and the passage of time, creating a continuous environment in which every detail was both present and softened by context. Nothing demanded focus, all invited gentle attention, drifting naturally from one element to the next. And as the night deepened, mist thickening softly around the rooftops, the eye could wander across these textures with calm patience, moving from shingles to beams, from stone to timber, tracing the quiet artistry of construction as it had evolved without hurry, preparing to notice the repetition and rhythm of buildings as they formed the larger pattern of streets ahead. From a slightly higher perspective, the city revealed itself as a collection of repeating forms, a subtle rhythm of houses and roofs stretching along the terraces. The timber frames, previously observed in quiet detail, now aligned with neighboring dwellings, forming lines that carried the eye across streets and lanes in gentle sequences. Roofs, arranged in staggered rows, rose and fell in soft undulations, their angles complementing one another in muted harmony. The effect was neither strict nor regimented. It was a cadence shaped by time, by practical construction, and by the slow evolution of the city's shape, offering a visual rhythm that invited calm attention. The variety within the repetition gave life to the pattern. Some roofs were higher, others lower. Shingles differed slightly in tone, reflecting moonlight in subtle gradients. The facades of houses alternated between exposed timber and stone infill, creating lines of texture that repeated with gentle irregularity. Small courtyards broke the continuity at intervals, offering pauses where shadow deepened and light faded, giving the rhythm space to breathe. The streets between houses carved soft channels for movement, their curves and angles guiding the observer without urgency. Chimneys punctuated the rooftops in irregular intervals, their forms extending upwards like slender, patient gestures. Some released faint ribbons of smoke that drifted lazily into the night air, dissolving into mist. Their presence reinforced the vertical dimension of the city, contrasting with the horizontal repetition of terraces and roofs. Even these minor elements contributed to the quiet symmetry of the urban pattern, moving subtly in tandem with air currents and shifting moonlight. Windows, viewed from this broader perspective, added small, delicate variations. Reflections caught from the river below created flickers along the aligned facades, a soft interplay of light across the repetitive structures. They punctuated lines of timber and stone without interrupting continuity, enhancing the gentle rhythm rather than challenging it. Some frames were closed, others slightly ajar, yet all contributed to the overall composition in an almost imperceptible choreography. The angles of roofs guided the eye naturally along the street grid, suggesting continuity beyond immediate view. Where terraces shifted or streets curved, the pattern adapted smoothly, each element responding to its neighbors with subtle accommodation. Shadows stretched and merged along the aligned facades, softening hard edges and blending geometry into an ongoing visual melody. The mind could follow the lines without effort, drifting from repetition to repetition, enjoying the calm consistency of form. Alleyways, narrow and often shaded, punctuated the broader patterns, creating breaks in continuity that felt deliberate yet unforced. They allowed glimpses of smaller courtyards, hidden gardens, and stairways, softening the repetitiveness with pockets of observation. Even these minor deviations were absorbed into the city's overall rhythm, their presence unnoticed unless one chose to linger, their subtlety adding depth without attention. Lanterns and scattered points of light marked streets at intervals. Their gentle glow, pale against timber and stone, accentuated both the repetition and the small variations within it. Light pooled along street surfaces, highlighting shingles, beams, and stonework with soft emphasis. Shadows created by eaves and overhangs enriched the rhythm, deepening troughs in the visual cadence, yet remained gentle and non-intrusive. The interplay of light and form felt carefully measured by the night itself. Along longer stretches, the viewer might notice the recurrence of narrow stairways rising between terraces. Each staircase was a miniature echo of the architectural pattern, its angle and proportion reflecting the broader rhythm of houses. Steps, worn smooth over time, offered tactile and visual continuity that complemented the roofs above and streets below. In moonlight, their forms were delicate, tracing faint lines that reinforced the gentle repetition of urban structure. The river's reflection continued to influence perception from this vantage point. Glimpses of water between rooftops mirrored segments of the city, duplicating lines and patterns in quiet undulation. Boats moved slowly below, their shadows contributing to the dynamic repetition without interruption. Even subtle motion became part of the city's calm cadence, integrated seamlessly with static forms, enhancing the perception of rhythm rather than disrupting it. Mist clung to corners and roof lines, softening edges and blending forms together. What might have been rigid became flowing, and repetition took on a dreamlike quality. Lines of houses dissolved gently into one another as haze thickened, their geometry perceptible yet forgiving. Details of shingles, beams, and stone became hints rather than statements, allowing the mind to wander along the structured forms without demand. Courtyards and small open spaces punctuated the rooftops in irregular intervals, offering breathing room for the pattern. The eye could pause here, noticing variations in paving stones, low fences, or the subtle arrangement of roof angles, before continuing along the next repetition of facades. This alternation of continuity and pause created a visual rhythm that was deliberate but unhurried, steadying attention while inviting drift. From this perspective, the city's overall composition revealed itself as a network of interlocking shapes and forms. Rows of houses aligned across terraces, dappled by light and shadow, repeated gently with small deviations that enriched the calm observation. The observer's gaze could flow from roofline to roofline, street to street, finding comfort in the predictability of form, yet engagement in the subtle variations that time and craft had introduced. Air moved softly across the rooftops, carrying faint scents of timber, stone, and moisture from the river below. The light breeze stirred slight variations in shadows, accentuating the patterns without altering them. Smoke from chimneys rose in long, deliberate columns, shifting gently in the wind and tracing faint echoes of verticality against the horizontal repetition of roofs. Every element contributed to the perception of a city breathing slowly, its rhythm extended across terraces, streets, and rooftops alike. The night remained expansive yet intimate, the eye guided by the alignment of shingles, beams, and walls. Patterns flowed naturally, with intervals and slight deviations that encouraged quiet observation. The city's repetition was both orderly and forgiving, allowing the observer to drift comfortably from one aligned structure to the next, gradually absorbing rhythm without effort or expectation. And as attention wandered along these measured rows, the subtle variations, slight differences in angles, the occasional tilt of a chimney, the delicate interplay of shadow and light, prepared the mind to notice the gentle motion below in the streets and squares, where human presence continued its quiet, unhurried rhythm. The eye descended from the patterned rooftops, settling onto the streets and open squares that threaded through the city like soft veins. Cobblestones, worn and smooth from countless journeys, reflected faint moonlight in subtle glimmers, while narrow lanes twisted gently between buildings, guiding movement with patience rather than precision. Here and there, shallow puddles caught the reflection of lanterns, scattering their pale glow across stones, merging light and surface in calm, reflective patterns. The city, so often observed from above, now revealed its quiet heartbeat along these channels of passage, alive in the most unassuming ways. Footsteps fell with gentle cadence upon the streets, echoing lightly in the distance, a soft counterpoint to the stillness of the surrounding architecture. Travelers moved without haste, each step measured and unhurried, as if the night had dictated a rhythm to be followed slowly, without interruption. Occasionally, the clatter of a small cart rolling over uneven cobbles joined the muted chorus, blending seamlessly with the sigh of wind through narrow alleys. Each sound contributed to a sense of continuity, a soft reminder that the city, though nearly still, was not frozen. Squares opened here and there, offering space for gatherings long since past, now quiet and waiting. Their surfaces bore traces of activity: worn stones, faintly eroded patterns of use, small depressions from past steps. Lanterns hung along edges or perched upon posts, their glow soft, highlighting the gentle geometry of the spaces without calling attention to themselves. Shadows stretched along the ground, shifting subtly with the moon's passage and the faint sway of overhead branches or distant chimney smoke. Alongside human presence, small hints of domestic life quietly made themselves known. Doors ajar allowed the faint scent of embers or earth to escape, blending with the cool night air. Cats moved silently along walls and rooftops, their steps absorbed into shadow, while the occasional dog, distant and subdued, offered a slow, echoing acknowledgement of presence. The city breathed softly, each living element a gentle contributor to the overall rhythm, unhurried, unobtrusive. Courtyards, hidden behind buildings or reached through narrow archways, revealed delicate patterns of daily arrangement. Small benches, bundles of cloth, and low fences stood in quiet repose, touched by dew or faintly gleaming in candlelight. Grass and moss grew in measured patches between stonework, softening edges and connecting man-made form to the earth beneath. These subtle details did not demand attention. They simply existed, offering quiet texture to those who observed slowly without expectation. Shops, when glimpsed along streets, showed closed shutters or faintly dusted windows. No sign called the observer forward. No display insisted on notice. Yet small details suggested life and labor. A faint shimmer of polished wood, the subtle curve of a folded awning, or the muted shadow of a barrel resting against a wall. Each object, each form, merged seamlessly into the calm visual rhythm, part of the city's breathing rather than separate from it. Intersecting streets offered gentle variation, their convergence creating softened nodes in the network of movement. Here, small fountains or stone markers occasionally punctuated the open space, their presence subtle and unobtrusive. Water, where present, trickled slowly, adding a muted undertone to the sparse chorus of the night. The observer could trace the flow of streets, moving mindfully from lane to lane, noting how each path joined the next with gradual, unforced alignment. Lanterns, sparsely arranged, illuminated parts of squares and streets in shifting patterns. Their glow revealed slight imperfections in stone surfaces, the gentle bow of timber frames, and the textured continuity of walls and pavement. Shadows danced quietly, never harshly, emphasizing form without drama. The interplay of light and darkness reinforced the city's gentle pulse, marking passage and space with calm deliberation. People moved along streets with measured care, carrying objects or performing small tasks, tending a lantern, adjusting a bundle of goods, sweeping a path. Motion was slow, almost imperceptible, yet it contributed to the feeling of life maintained in balance with rest. There was no urgency, no chase, no overt purpose beyond the continuation of routine. Footsteps and movement, so faint and regular, mirrored the rhythm of the city itself, each action a quiet note in an ongoing nocturne. Animals also played their part in this subtle ballet. Small dogs or cats slipped between shadows, moving along walls and alleys with quiet grace. Birds, resting in the eaves, occasionally adjusted position, their feathers brushing softly against wood. Each creature moved in accordance with the slow tempo of the night, invisible except to those who paused long enough to notice. Together with human motion, these gentle presences wove a continuous pattern of calm activity across the streets and squares. Corners and intersections offered gentle surprises. A narrow stairway led upward from one street to another, offering a brief variation in line and slope. A low arch created a softly enclosed passage, where shadows deepened and surfaces of timber and stone became more pronounced. The observer could wander without expectation, following the slow, deliberate curves of streets, feeling the steady pulse of the city without needing to understand its purpose or direction. From certain vantage points, the river remained a faint presence, glimpsed between rooftops and alongside alleys. Reflections of moonlight on water mirrored some of the city's motion, softening angles and adding the distant suggestion of flow beneath the steady repetition of streets. The movement of boats, muted and measured, echoed the pace of pedestrians, creating a subtle dialogue between river and city that enhanced the quiet continuity of urban life. At times, light fog gathered low over open squares, softening the lines of walls, paving stones, and small fountains. Edges became less defined, textures softened, and movement, both of people and animals, seemed to stretch, drawn out by the gentle diffusion of light. Mist carried the faint scent of river and wood, merging air, stone, and timber into a calm, unified presence. The city appeared simultaneously detailed and dreamlike, concrete yet ethereal. The combined rhythm of streets and squares guided the eye naturally. One could follow a line of cobblestones, pause to notice a low wall, shift to the faint glow of a distant lantern, and then drift onward without ever being forced to focus. Movement was continuous yet subdued, forming a pattern that repeated across blocks and alleys, allowing attention to settle comfortably without urgency. In this quiet motion, the city revealed its nocturnal pulse, steady, predictable, and soothing. Small open areas provided subtle contrast to narrow lanes. Pavement widened, walls receded, and faint echoes of past gatherings lingered. Shadows stretched across stones, leaving gentle undulations that mirrored those found in adjacent streets. Lanterns flickered in soft agreement with moonlight, creating harmonies of illumination that moved imperceptibly with air currents. Footsteps, faint and distant, traversed these areas with the same measured calm, reinforcing the city's unhurried rhythm. And as the night continued, the observer's attention could drift from individual streets to the broader organization of alleys and squares, noticing the soft ebb and flow of motion within the city, gradually preparing to lift the gaze outward toward the surrounding landscapes, where buildings receded and the quiet expanse of land awaited observation. Beyond the clustered streets and quiet squares, the edges of the city began to thin, and the built environment gradually gave way to open lands where the city's rhythm dissolved into gentler, slower forms. Rooflines tapered, buildings became smaller and more sporadic, and occasional gardens or enclosed yards marked the final human footprints upon the ground. Paths led outward, faint and winding, carrying the eye from the dense urban grid toward the expanses that stretched softly into the distance. Here the city's pulse slowed further, blending with the subtle movements of open earth, grass and riverbank beyond. Along these outskirts, the cobblestones became less frequent, replaced by packed dirt and scattered gravel that whispered faintly under passing footsteps. Fences of timber or low stone walls marked boundaries in careful irregularity, their textures softened by the accumulating shadows of night. The gentle slope of land led down toward open meadows, and in low hollows, puddles mirrored the moonlight, echoing the muted reflections once glimpsed along the central streets. The air itself felt wider, carrying scents of earth and water, cool and calm, mingling the faint aroma of smoke from distant chimneys with the freshness of open terrain. Small clusters of buildings appeared intermittently along winding lanes, each surrounded by its modest courtyard or garden. These structures, simpler and lower than their urban counterparts, seemed at ease in the quiet night, their walls absorbing the fading echoes of city life while they awaited the stillness of rest. Roofs and chimneys maintained subtle repetition, yet their irregular spacing allowed the eye to drift without obstruction, offering gentle pauses between forms. The spaces between buildings became soft corridors where shadows deepened, and moonlight traced slow, reflective patterns across walls and pathways. Beyond these outer dwellings, the land opened to a mosaic of fields and meadows, occasionally punctuated by hedgerows or low rises. Grasses swayed lightly in the breeze, the motion soft and continuous, suggesting a rhythm distinct yet harmonious with the city's fading pulse. Tiny flowers caught silver light in small, transient glimmers, adding hints of texture to the otherwise vast expanses. Occasional fences or posts marked old boundaries, now quiet and unused, their presence a faint whisper of the past, barely influencing the gentle flow of observation across the landscape. The river, widening as it left the denser urban confines, carried a slow, reflective current that traced the contours of the land. Its surface caught the pale illumination of moonlight, broken occasionally by reeds or the gentle arch of a small boat resting at its bank. Sounds were muted and distant, the soft lap of water at the edge blending with the quiet murmur of wind moving across open terrain. The river became a guiding line, linking city to country, reflecting both structures and the emptier spaces that stretched beyond. Hills rose gradually in the distance, their slopes softened by haze and night air. They appeared as faint, undulating silhouettes, layered one behind the other, fading gently into the horizon. Their presence lent depth and a slow sense of scale to the outskirts, allowing the observer's gaze to wander without interruption, tracing the subtle rise and fall of land, the quiet continuity of sky meeting earth. Light shifted imperceptibly across these forms as the night deepened, shadows lengthened, and contours softened, suggesting motion in the stillness. Scattered trees punctuated the edge of the city and the adjacent lands, their branches casting delicate, lacy shadows on fields and paths. Leaves rustled quietly in the wind, each movement slight, continuous, and soothing, adding an organic rhythm that contrasted with the geometric repetition of the city streets. Small hedgerows or clusters of bushes marked divisions between parcels of land, their textures blending with surrounding grass and soil, offering quiet variation within the broad sweep of openness. From certain vantage points along the city's perimeter, distant hills met the river's course in gentle curves, creating a natural framing of space. Shadows pooled in low valleys, softening lines and angles, while higher slopes caught faint, reflective light. Observers could follow the slow progression of terrain from near to far, the eye wandering along natural contours without demand, moving in a continuous, unhurried rhythm. Every subtle rise, every gentle dip, contributed to the overall impression of calm expansiveness. Paths extended outward from the city like faint lines drawn into the countryside, unmarked yet persistent. The dirt shifted lightly under wind or passing footsteps, dust catching a touch of moonlight as it rose and settled. Here, traces of movement were rare, deliberate, and gentle. Sometimes a small cart, sometimes a lone traveler, all moving in accordance with the night's unhurried cadence. Each step or wheel added to the quiet narrative of land meeting city, the boundaries blurring softly under observation. Mist gathered lightly in low areas and along the river's edge, merging ground, water, and air into a seamless layer. Shapes of trees, distant buildings, and rolling fields softened into gradients of gray and silver, emphasizing depth while minimizing sharpness. The city's hard lines dissolved gradually into this haze, leaving the observer with impressions of form, pattern, and rhythm without definition. In this diffusion, the mind could drift freely across space, tracing contours without strain, absorbing scale without tension. Occasional solitary figures moved along the outskirts, caretakers, travelers, or watchmen, each measured in pace, their shadows long and merged with surrounding shapes. Animals, small and unobtrusive, wandered quietly, dogs along paths, birds settling among trees, and livestock grazing at a distance, all participating in the gentle motion of edge life. Their presence reinforced the subtle vibrancy of the landscape, never urgent, never commanding, only quietly aligned with the slow tempo of night. The interplay of land, water, and human edge constructions created layers of observation. One could note a fence here, a winding path there, the shimmer of river against distant reeds, or the faint silhouette of a small building on a hill. These layers, while distinct, flowed together seamlessly in perception, allowing attention to wander without interruption, offering soft patterns for contemplation, and leaving the mind unburdened by detail or urgency. Above, the night sky stretched wide, pale light falling over hills, meadows, and rivers, connecting the edges of the city with surrounding lands. Clouds drifted slowly, softening points of brightness and spreading gentle gradients across the horizon. The air carried subtle fragrances of damp soil, grass, and river, merging with the distant scent of chimney smoke. All elements combined into a calm, immersive expanse where observation could dissolve into ease, where the mind could float across space without direction, and where the rhythm of edges and openness set the stage for complete quiet. And as the eye lingered upon the widening view from the last buildings to the farthest hills, the mind was invited to rise with it, drifting slowly toward the stillness of distant fields, the soft flow of the river, and the horizon where night stretched uninterrupted, preparing gently for the final descent into silence. As the eye drifted farther from the last buildings, the soft outlines of distant hills and the faint curve of the river merged into a diffuse horizon, where moonlight and mist intermingled in gentle silvery gradients. The city, once defined by the measured lines of streets and rooftops, now softened into a faint impression, its forms blurring into the surrounding landscape. The night deepened, and with it, the separation between shapes became less distinct. The edges of walls, the texture of stone, and the subtle motions of life were absorbed into quiet, gradually fading patterns that the mind could observe without strain. Fields stretched endlessly in subdued tones, their grasses moving softly in unseen breezes, creating waves of texture that rose and fell in calm repetition. A few scattered trees stood like gentle markers upon the land, their branches swaying ever so slightly, casting delicate shadows across the ground. In the distance, the faint outlines of hills wavered under a haze, their contours fading slowly into sky and night. Everything seemed to inhale in unison with the quiet rhythm of the observer's own breath, a seamless continuity between self, land, and moonlit sky. Water, where glimpsed, reflected the soft glimmer of moonlight in long liquid shapes. The river's slow current whispered quietly, moving in harmony with the gentle rustle of reeds and the distant call of a bird settling for the night. Occasional reflections from the city's far edges shimmered faintly, like memories of patterns now gone, blending with the wider, open spaces. Sounds, movement, and form diminished gradually, becoming elements in a broader, dreamlike tapestry that invited the mind to rest. Mist lay low over meadows and along riverbanks, softening contours and merging the earth with air. Shapes became less certain, and the perception of distance stretched outward, allowing the eye to wander without focus. The stillness encouraged reflection without thought, a quiet space where imagination could drift freely over subdued textures, subtle light, and faint lines of shadow. Here the city's pulse, once slow and deliberate, dissolved entirely into the night, leaving only the sensation of calm continuity. The final hints of rooftops and streets shimmered faintly in the distance, their geometry softening as though painted in watercolors. Paths that once guided movement now suggested direction only in gentle impressions, fading into the surrounding meadows. The last of human sound, subtle footsteps, and the faint clatter of distant carts vanished gradually, leaving the countryside in a state of hushed observation. The mind could follow these vanishing traces, noting the transition from organized human form to open natural space without urgency or expectation. Clouds drifted slowly overhead, their edges illuminated with soft, reflective moonlight. Shadows across land and water shifted imperceptibly as night deepened, elongating forms and smoothing contrasts. The interplay of darkness and pale light became uniform, soothing, and unbroken, inviting the eye to rest wherever it fell. Each layer of observation, the river, the fields, the far hills, the softened city remnants, melded into a singular quiet, where shapes remained, yet attention could release entirely. A gentle wind moved across open meadows, rustling grasses and carrying subtle scents of damp earth and river. Leaves brushed together softly, and occasional reeds bent to the motion, producing whispers of sound that harmonized with the rhythm of night. Any creature that remained moved almost imperceptibly, birds shifting in their roosts, small mammals navigating underbrush, and the distant flow of water, all contributing to a calm, continuous presence. There was motion, yet it demanded no attention, allowing the mind to drift in sync with the slow, overarching pattern of the night. The horizon stretched further, a gradient of fading light merging sky and land. Hints of color, pale silver, soft grays, and muted blues, blended without edges, erasing distinctions between objects and distance. Even the river, once a distinct shape threading through the land, became a faint line within the overall wash of textures. Observers could feel the space expand infinitely outward, their vision carried along soft currents of observation, unrestricted, unhurried, untethered. Occasional forms remained, subtle and abstract. A solitary tree on a hill, a low rise reflecting moonlight, the shimmer of water against distant reeds. Each existed without demand, integrated into the overarching calm. Patterns of light, shadow, and faint movement encouraged mental drift, allowing attention to wander gently across the scene without pause or need for understanding. Time itself felt slower, the progression of night elongated and softened, drawing all thought and observation into the rhythm of rest. As the city and surrounding lands dissolved into twilight and silence, the senses became attuned to the intangible. The shapes of streets and rooftops, of fields and hills, lingered in soft memory, guiding the observer's eye across space without effort. Sounds, now nearly absent, blended with the pulse of one's own breathing, forming a quiet continuity that extended outward into the fading horizon. Every element, the gentle sway of grass, the lapping of water, the drifting mist, the far-off hills, combined to create a seamless, calming expanse where the mind could finally let go. Shadows and light interplayed subtly across all surfaces, with contours disappearing into gentle gradients. Forms that were once distinct softened into abstract impressions, lines of walls, pathways, and roofs melting into expanses of meadow and river. Each detail, once observed with attention, became part of a collective hush, a quiet presence in which perception itself could dissolve. The night's vastness expanded, encouraging the mind to drift and relax, following the smooth transitions from land to sky without urgency, without focus, without thought. Finally, the eye, carrying traces of city, river, and field, rested upon the farthest reaches of the horizon, where the landscape, dimly defined, merged seamlessly with night's soft veil. The observer could feel the city fading fully into the background, its structures and streets no longer separate from the enveloping quiet. The surrounding lands, illuminated faintly by moonlight, extended without boundary, offering gentle textures and muted forms that encouraged the mind to settle entirely, floating along with the slow, unbroken rhythm of twilight and silence. The soft diffusion of light, movement, and shadow created a final impression. A city, a river, hills, and fields existing together in a state of calm continuity, all dissolving gradually into the enveloping night. Observation no longer required effort, thought no longer demanded attention, and the mind could drift freely, carried along by the gentle, persistent rhythm of the fading city and surrounding lands, toward complete rest and quietude. You don't need to keep listening anymore. The story can fade into the background now, becoming softer with every moment. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine. There's no rush and nothing you need to remember. Just let your breathing slow down, let your thoughts drift where they want to go, and allow the quiet of this night to settle around you. This story will remain here, gently playing while you rest. Tomorrow night, a new night will be waiting for you, and it's one you won't want to miss. And if sleep hasn't arrived just yet, you can quietly return to one of the previous nights, and let those stories guide you instead. For now, sleep well.